In order to show remaining time within activity seconds to complete component, this remaining time should be passed as a part of activity object, as a prop inside of activity seconds to complete component. And all activities objects are stored within activities array inside of app component. And by the way, whenever we're gonna start tracking the time for this activity by using this stopwatch, every second we're gonna fire custom event all the way up to the root component, so it can update tracked time for a particular activity. And now let's check it out how this works in terms of code. Let's open up timeline stopwatch component, and inside of a start function, this function is executed whenever we start our stopwatch. We're gonna fire custom event update seconds every second. So inside of the parent component, which is timeline item component, we listen for this event update seconds and fire another event update activity seconds to the parent component. And along with this event, we pass the amount of seconds we just received from timeline stopwatch component. So as it usually goes, inside of the timeline component, we have a listener for update activity seconds component, which in turn will fire another custom event update timeline item activity seconds to the root component so it can update remaining time. But in order to know for which timeline item object we should update activity seconds property, we should include this object as part of this event. So as a second parameter in here, we're passing timeline item object for which we need to update activity seconds property. And as a third parameter, we're passing the actual value of seconds. And finally, within the app component, we have registered a listener update timeline item activity seconds, which is basically going to add value of seconds to activity seconds property of timeline item object. So as we can see, we had to do a lot of work in order to update this single property activity seconds. We had to fire a custom event from timeline stopwatch component all the way up to the root component. But what if we could just simply provide an access to this function, so this function can be called right from timeline stopwatch component, without having to handle lots of custom events? And there is actually a way to do just that, and it's called provide inject. This is so-called the dependency injection approach that Vue provides us with. And in order to provide access to the function or a variable from some component to all its children components, we can use function called provide. As a first parameter in here, we're specifying the key under which variable or a function will be accessed from the child component. And as a second parameter, we specify a reference to this function or variable that we'd like to provide access to. And since we are providing access to update timeline item activity seconds function, we're specifying the reference to this function as a second argument, and then this provide function should be imported from the Vue package. So let's do that up here. And now we no longer need to listen for some custom events, such as update timeline item activity seconds on the timeline component. Let's remove this event registration from here, and then go back to timeline stopwatch component. And here, in order to access that function from the app component that we have just provided access to by using provide function, we need to call here inject function, which should also be imported from the Vue package like this. And all we have to do in this component is basically create new constant with any name. This constant will store the reference to that function from the root component. And by simply calling the function inject with a proper key, we're able to get a reference to the function from the root component. And now, since we need to call this function every second to update the time for the timeline object, we can simply call this function within this set interval closure instead of firing update seconds event every second. And now let's see what kind of arguments we have to provide to this function. So inside of the app component, we can see that this function accepts two arguments. First one is the timeline item object, and the second one, activity seconds. So firstly, we need to get access to timeline item object inside of timeline stopwatch component. And we can do so by passing prop with the name timeline item from timeline item component into timeline stopwatch, like so. And now we no longer need to pass these two extra properties, seconds and hour, because this data is contained within timeline item object. So let's remove these two properties from here, and also remove the import of isNumber function from here. And just because we are no longer sending custom event update activity seconds from the timeline item component, we can remove this registration from define emits macro. After this, let's go to timeline stopwatch component and modify property declarations. So this component no longer accepts props with names hour and seconds. So let's remove this prop declaration. And instead, this component is going to accept only one prop called timeline item, which will be required. The type of this prop will be an object, and the validation function will be is timeline item valid. Let's go up and quickly import this function from validators module and remove the import for isOurValid function. And by the way, isNumber function is no longer used in this component, so let's remove this one as well. And now let's modify the way we access value of seconds and hour by using props object. And since now we pass only one prop called timeline item, we need to gain access to seconds property by using timeline item object. In this case, we're gonna use a reference to activity seconds property on this timeline item object. And by the way, we already have a props object declared in here, so let's scroll a little bit down. And here, when we access our property, we need to do so by using timeline item prop, like this. And because we are no longer firing custom event update seconds from timeline stopwatch component, we can simply remove define emits macro. And now we have all required data in this component to pass to update timeline item activity seconds function. So by using props object, we're gonna pass timeline item object as the first argument to this function, and as a second argument, we're passing amount of seconds, just like before. Let's specify 1 second. So we can safely remove this emit function. Let's scroll down to reset function. In this function, we also fire this custom event. So let's replace this event on update timeline item activity seconds function call. But as we can see, as a second argument to this function call, we need to pass value of seconds reactive variable with a negative sign, like so. And since we are directly calling this function from the root component, we don't need to listen for update activity seconds event from the timeline component. Let's remove this event registration from here. And the same goes with this event registration within define emits macro. Let's remove this function. And because of that, isNumber function is no longer used. Let's also remove this import. And right now, within Vue Developer Tools, if we take a look at the right side, in here we're gonna see the new section called provided. And this section lists our new function that was provided from within root component, update timeline item activity seconds. Which means all the child components of the root component can easily gain access to this function and call it directly. So right now, if I'm going to start tracking time for the coding activity by using this stopwatch, this component now has access to that update timeline item activity seconds function. So it can easily call that function directly to update the time of a particular timeline item object. And this updated time, of course, will be reflected within activity seconds to complete component on the activities page. So we have drastically simplified the code of updating activity seconds for a particular activity, because we no longer have to fire custom event every second from timeline stopwatch component all the way back to the app component just to update single property of the timeline item object. And we were able to do so by providing access to update timeline item activity seconds function to all child components of the root component by using provide function call. And if any child component will need to gain access to this function, it can simply call inject with the corresponding key under which that function was registered within the root component. And this is exactly what we're doing within timeline stopwatch component by calling this function directly. And in the upcoming lessons, we're gonna use this provide inject technique a lot to provide access to some data or function from parent components to descendant components.